Well, hello, everybody. It's good to see you. It's good to be gathering both in person and online. And I guess this is my second deep reconstruction workshop, so it's really great to be back. My title is, in fact, Putting Medical Imaging in Context, Deep Reconstruction and Connected Scanners of the Future. And just in case you're curious, the picture you see here is what you get when you type Connected Scanners of the Future into ChatGPT or its companion Dolly. So I'm not sure what the flowers are doing in the midst of the other medical images, but so be it. Just before we move on, my financial interests for your consideration. A number of these are vaguely related to my thoughts about the future of connected scanners, but there's no direct influence at all. So my title mentioned scanners of the future. What might they look like? And certainly if we go to the MR field, which is where I'm most strongly based, we've had this very kind of progressive, bigger is better trend developing since the invention of MRI in the first place. We marched up from 0.1 T all the way up to 7 Tesla. That's a picture of a 7 Tesla scanner at NYU. And we've done this to try to get more SNR, resolution, speed, contrast, etc. But in recent years, there's been a really interesting trend in precisely the opposite direction. So over the last decade or so, we've had this remarkable race to the bottom in field strength. What you're seeing there at the bottom is now our 64 millitesla hyperfine scanner that we have. We actually have 2 of those, so that's twice as many as the rather aging 7 Tesla that we have at NYU now. And this is largely now for the purpose of accessibility. And that will raise some very interesting questions for reconstruction, among other things. Well, our sister field of astronomy has actually had its own bigger is better trend, of course, going back many centuries from the early spyglasses that people used to see things far away as if they were near, to, of course, these huge gargantuan radio dishes that we use. But astronomy did something really interesting that I think we should pay attention to in medical imaging. Their dishes weren't big enough, ultimately, to see what they really wanted to see. So what did they do? They connected different observatories around the globe to form something called the Event Horizon Telescope, which is effectively a telescope with the dish size of the Earth. But that's not just a bigger is better trend. Because really what they're doing there is they're using connected, coordinated information across these multiple different observatories to basically get more than they could with any one alone. In other words, they're using context, in this case, global context. Okay, well, so can we do something similar in medical imaging? What kind of context do we have access to? Well, at first glance, not really that much. Right? We've got our scanner here, and generally we take our case-based acquisitions, it's an MR example, and we generate our image. What's the context there? Well, actually, if you think about it, there's a whole heck of a lot of context going on. First of all, there's all the volumetric context, because we normally don't just acquire a single slice, we acquire a volume. But we don't just acquire one volume. Usually, with MR, it's the king of complementary contrast, right? So we acquire a T1 and a T2 and a diffusion weighting and so on. And all of those are effectively different views of the very same anatomy. And then, of course, there are all the other modalities that we acquire in a patient who might need, a particular type of follow-up. We have sensors of various sorts sitting inside our scanner that are gathering data simultaneously while we scan. And then, of course, there's the whole electronic health record, which at the moment, we don't incorporate in any way at all in our reconstructions. And of course, all of this is just for a single time point, that one time we're seeing the patient. What about the last time we saw them? And the time before that, and the time before that, and the times we will see them in the future. So in a way, when we just take our scanner and reconstruct our image, we're ignoring vast context. We're basically giving ourselves deliberate tunnel vision. So the question then is, okay, well, if all of this context exists, how might we use it? in image reconstruction. And I'm going to try to give you two examples of some early attempts we've been making to take advantage of this rich context for imaging. The first is the most relevant to this conference. It's use of side information specifically for image reconstruction. And the second is a little bit of a spin-off using longitudinal imaging, in this case for risk assessment. And then I'll finish off with just a little bit of a broader picture about how all of these things might actually help us, not just with our traditional radiologic enterprise, but with a sort of newer idea of longitudinal monitoring of health, not only in high-resource settings, but also getting back to that question of accessibility in settings that don't have our traditional high-performance scanners. Okay, well, since I'm the first talk in this workshop, which is all about reconstruction, let me just lay the groundwork for MR image reconstruction. We painstakingly slowly, from our point of view, scan in our case-based data, our raw MR data, and then once we have it all, we can do a transform, in this case, at baseline, a Fourier transform, quite simple, to generate our image, right? But of course, I mentioned it's painstakingly slow to gather all of that data. Nowadays, we almost never gather Nyquist sufficient data if we don't have to. We'll undersample. And of course, when we undersample, there's consequent aliasing and other artifacts that we necessarily incur. And so how do we clean those up? How do we get our reconstruction? Well, of course, this is, and I don't know how many times this equation will be shown at this workshop. Last workshop, it popped up dozens of times. But basically, you solve an inverse problem, and we're going to hear about that over and over. In this case, you have a data consistency term, and you have some sort of regularizer, right? And one thing that I found actually a little bit humbling, I was making these slides and I realized that, the entire more than quarter a century of my career can be fit into different solutions to this equation. So in 1996, I sort of started off my career with parallel MRI, which is sort of one version of this without really much in the way of regularization. Compressed sensing came along a decade later, and we had now a sparsity-based regularizer. And then another decade after that, I don't know what it is, about decades here, deep learning entered the field, and we learned our regularizers in new ways. So this is a picture of one of the earliest, in this case, unfolded variational neural networks that we tried to do this task back in 2016. That was eventually replaced with a cascade of UNets to accomplish the same type of thing. And again, I'm sure we'll hear over and over about these types of network topologies and applications. And of course, you don't have to use UNets, you don't have to use cascades like this. You can use transformers, you can use diffusion models, whatever the hottest technique is, and we'll hear a lot about those. Well, that's great, but where does context fit in to any of that? Well, traditionally, this is what we call prior knowledge, right? So what we want to do in a regularized inverse problem is we want to disambiguate undersampled or ill-conditioned cases, either based on physics, so that's kind of the data consistency term. We're ensuring our solution is at least consistent with the acquisition physics, based on general image properties, so that would be handcrafted regularizers like sparsity-based regularizers, or based on learned image properties as we use in AI. But there are many limits that I think we all recognize to this type of traditional use of prior knowledge. We might use it too little. You might have inefficient incorporation of that prior knowledge, which gives you limited acceleration capability, say, in MRI. Maybe 3, 4x in one dimension is about the best you can get before you start degrading. Or you can rely on it too much, and that, of course, leads to the very familiar problem of hallucination. So I want to talk about a slightly different type of prior here, and this is subject-specific side information. So case-specific contextual information that you use to supplement all these general principles we're already using, as well as the population characteristics we get from training a neural net. So this might be other contrasts. This might be other modalities. This might be prior scans. It might even be text reports or lab values, which we typically don't incorporate into our image reconstructions, right? And so I'm going to talk for most of the talk about a new use of side information, which is efficient. It's incorporated, as you'll see, as a learned regularizer into an unrolled neural network, because that's the kind of net that we like to work with most. And I'm going to put it to you that we think it's relatively safe. We use something called trust guidance. In other words, projection onto what we call the ambiguous space to protect against hallucination. And I'll tell you about that too. So here's the idea in a nutshell. And this is work by Arda Atalik, my graduate student working with me, and Sumit Chopra at NYU. This came out in an archive paper just a month or two ago. And we're, working on updating it soon. The basic idea is if you have an undersampled problem, can you see my, I guess you can't see the pointer, so that's fine. But if you look over there, that sort of blurry image, that's our undersampled image. And because it's, poorly conditioned and not fully sampled, you have this sort of large ambiguous space of possible solutions, right? And your job in image reconstruction is to choose the correct one. Well, you can sort of divide that space, if you know the forward operator, into a space with large singular values and a space with small singular values. And the space with large singular values is pretty well known. It's pretty well determined by the acquisition physics. The part with low singular values, that's the part that when we invert it, amplifies noise, gives us all of this uncertainty. And so what we're doing in this approach, this trust-guided approach, is we're taking prior information, say a different scan in that patient, and we are pulling the reconstruction towards that. We're using that to eliminate the unwanted solutions. But we're only doing it in that ambiguous space. We're first projecting onto the space of low singular values so that we don't overwrite the things that we know well. We don't overwrite the given data. And by the way, I mentioned you can use prior images, other contrasts, EHR. You can also use pre-learned features as your priors. So for example, that's an interesting role for foundation models. If you've been able to generate nice compact representations of prior images or data, you can use that as your prior to it. And now let me show you how. So here's that equation I showed you at the beginning, data consistency and regularizer. We're just adding a term, the term in blue here. And what you see is that term is enforcing a Euclidean, is minimizing a Euclidean distance between a projection of our image guess X and some learned transform H of our side information. And I'll show you particular examples there. That projection, once again, is a projection onto the space of the forward operator that has singular values that fall below a certain threshold. And it turns out, I won't go into details now for time, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, you can implement that pretty easily with a few conjugate gradient steps. So it's not all that difficult at all to implement. So you have that. You can also look at it in the Landweber iteration form, which is nice to fit into an unrolled network. And this is sort of what it looks like. We have a cascade of UNets, basically, and at each stage, we have a data consistency term, we have a refinement block, which is our learned regularizer, and then we have this ASC in the sort of light blue-green, which is our ambiguous space consistency term. That ambiguous space consistency, remember I had that learned transform of the side information, that we just use with a UNet, and the UNet is also our regularization block. Basically what we're doing is we're saying we don't want to force our, say, T1 weighted image to have the same contrast as our T2 weighted image. We want to learn, based on the data, an appropriate transform of the T2 that appropriately disambiguates the T1. So this is almost like image quality transfer, but now anchored with data. So a couple examples. We used a couple of data sets here, one in the knee. This is our fast MRI data set with knee images, and then a brain data set, the M4 raw public data set at 0.3 Tesla. And I'll show you examples in both. So here's kind of the results in a nutshell. That's your 20x undersampled, in this case, PDFS, proton density fat saturated image. For those of you who aren't MR experts, anyone have an idea what piece of anatomy that is? It's the knee. Many of you may have seen that, but it's kind of hard to see much beyond the fact that it's the knee, right? At 20-fold undersampling, we're really not seeing a lot of detail. We then gather a proton density scan with a different contrast, and instead of gathering it fully sampled, we say, what the heck, let's gather it 2-fold undersampled as well, and we'll keep the aliases there. But we're going to use that as our prior information. We feed that into our TGVN, and out pops a 20-fold accelerated, cleaned up image, which looks a whole lot like a knee. And in fact, if you look at the 1x unaccelerated reference, it's pretty darn close. And let me blow it up here a little bit. You can see in there where the arrow's pointing, that's actually a subtle meniscal tear, which is being preserved out of this 20-fold accelerated image. The interesting thing, which some of you may be wondering about, is actually in the side information, if I unfold that side information, that tear is actually not really visible in the side information at all. So we are not hallucinating it out in the main information. We're effectively just using the side information to disambiguate and letting the data tell us the fine details. So that's an example in the knee. Just to show you, this is what the undersampling pattern looks like underneath. So in the 20-fold accelerated case, we have this like 3% dense center of K-space and really just a smattering of lines on the outside. We really don't have that much to hang our high resolution on. So this is almost like a pretty extreme super resolution case as well. And yet, as you saw, it still preserves the underlying details. And the side information is undersampled with a regular, every other line. Here's another example in a knee, 20-fold acceleration. And what you can see on the left, it's comparison of our normal variational network, end-to-end variational network, with no side information, with side information and the reference. And you see in the yellow areas that all of those details, including that sort of dark stripe up towards the top of the knee, those are all preserved with the side information. They're all completely obliterated without the presence of side information at this high acceleration. And those are just the sampling details for any MR jocks who want to take a look at it. Okay, and here's an example in the brain. This is actually a 36-fold acceleration. We accomplished that by an 18-fold acceleration, I'll show you here, of K-space, plus this was, because they were low field, they were multi-repetition examples because they wanted to boost the SNR. We just took it down to a single repetition. So this is a combination of reconstruction and denoising. And what you can see again is on your left, with no side information, we've basically got a poster of a brain, right? All of those structures are just kind of smeared out. It's like an average brain. But you get the actual sulcal features and the gray-white features back again once you put that side information in. Now, of course, because we want to get this published, we had to compare with any number of baselines. This is the standard nowadays. I personally, by the way, hate little figures with postage stamp sized images. You'll know this if you ever work for me as a student or if you ever get me as a reviewer. So what I'm going to do is blow it up for you. So we have our E2E varnat, that's without any side information. We have M-trans and MC varnet, which are two prior techniques that were developed to incorporate side information. And what you see is they all hallucinate away that subtle meniscal tear. We did some others as well. We did a diffusion-based DMSI, and then ours and the target. And in the DMSI, you can start to see maybe some hints of that tear, but it also actually adds a lot of noise. Whereas RTGVN also does this additional denoising. And if you actually went back and looked at the difference image, you can see that the TGVN has a substantially smaller difference image and a substantially higher SSIM, about 86 SSIM compared to like 65 for the diffusion. And here's just showing you as a function of acceleration, we took the TGVN and then the next best performing, which was the MCVN, as well as the E2E varnet. And what you can see is basically the TGVN, it drops in performance, but much more slowly than the others, and keeps the performance relatively high all the way out to 20x. And on the right, what you can see is we also decided to keep the main acceleration at 20x and increase the acceleration of our side information. Because, hey, we don't necessarily want to spend too much time gathering the side information either. And what you can see there is as we go up from 2x to 3x to 5x on the side information acceleration, still the performance is relatively improved if you're using this side information in this way. One thing you might all be wondering as well is, well, okay, that's great, but what if your side information is not registered to the main information? What if the patient has moved in between? Well, it turns out that we can deal with that as well. And the way to deal with it is actually to introduce deliberate rotations and translations as data augmentations into the training. When we do that, we find that we can train the network to be relatively invariant to those types of small changes. So you see here the reference, the registered case, the misregistered, where we've now trained with misregistrations, and we still get pretty good features. If we don't use side information, again, we sort of blur out that whole region that you see with the yellow box. And the side information, as you can see, has a lot of the same anatomical structure, but it's a completely different contrast. So we don't want to just copy that over. Oh yeah, and that's the blow up for you, just showing we preserve, even with misregistration, we preserve the spatial information, which is obliterated if we don't use the side info. Okay, well, what's next? Well, these are using prior scans, but prior by a few minutes. They were acquired earlier in the same imaging exam on that same subject. Next, we want to use exams that were acquired months or years earlier from a completely different imaging exam. Why not? It's the same principle. And so the idea here is, if this works anywhere near as well as it's been working for us with this, basically the more times we see you, the faster we can image you. The more we have as side information, the more we can bump that acceleration while still preserving the unique information from today. By the way, this is if you have a small number of time points, like 1 prior scan, 2 prior scans. If you actually have dynamic scans and you've done dynamics not just today but a previous time, you can take a sort of different approach. We love sort of dynamic imaging with the GRASP technique. Ricardo Otazo, one of the inventors of GRASP, is here in the audience today and speaking later. But basically, why limit your dynamic reconstruction to just 1 session? If you actually have dynamics from multiple sessions, you can treat it as 1 long time series. There'll be differences between them, but hey, the heart is contracting and relaxing, the diaphragm's going up and down even during a single session. It turns out when you do this, basically what we did is from day 0 to day 27, we did 3 different studies, one with 500 spokes, i.e. more sampling, then 300, then 200. We progressively decreased the sampling. You start seeing the reconstruction. I don't know how well it projects, I apologize, but you start seeing the reconstruction sort of struggle at the end with 200 spokes, but it crisps right back up if you now use a dynamic series covering all 3. So a number of ways to skin this cat. And then another thing that others in my group, that's by the way by Jingjia Chen, a postdoc in the group along with Li Feng, another GRASP inventor there. And then Lava Pneumopathy and Gozda Unal in the group are also trying to do something similar, now instead using the VJEPA architecture, which is something Jan LeCun and team put out for dealing with movies, because you can think about it basically, you know, in this case as dynamic images. Okay, well, speaking of Lavanya, she and Hirsch Chandarana have also been using longitudinal information, in this case the prostate imaging data set that I briefly showed Arda was going to use, not to reconstruct images, but to go directly from the data to predict your risk of disease, in this case your risk of clinically significant prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is a case where if you have a moderate risk, we tend to bring you back, say, each year for sequential MR scans, because most prostate cancer really doesn't need to be treated. You just want to catch it when it changes, when it has that sort of inflection point. And so she built this sort of risk prediction module where you take today's images and you learn to predict risk, And then you use prior images to kind of refine that risk, almost like a radiologist would, looking back at previous images and saying, oh, is it the same as last time? Or is it different than last time? And if it's different than last time, maybe your risk is higher because it's advanced. And I'll just show you quickly some results. Basically, what you see is, for the current risk today, you start out with a pretty good AUC and a nice sensitivity, 89 or 90%. The specificity stinks, though. But if you use prior scans with just one time point, you can bump up to 60% specificity, which corresponds to 106 false positives in this case that were directly converted into true negatives. Nothing else changed. So you're just improving your confidence by using the past. Same thing if you look at your 5-year risk. It's a smaller number of patients because we needed scans that were separated by 5 years and we had fewer of those. But once again, your specificity goes from 47% up to 61%. We saved 24 false positives and turned them into true negatives. So basically, in medical imaging, we're all very good with space. But I think what this is showing is we still have a lot to learn about using time and other context. Okay, just a couple more things, then I'll close. One of the other things we've done in the group, and this is work by Sumit Chopra here, is we've said, hey, listen, if we want to do a risk prediction module like this, not a reconstruction, if we just want a binary answer, high risk or low risk of clinically significant prostate cancer, how many data lines can we get away with? And in fact, what we found is we can also undersample by up to, say, 20-fold. And still not touch our ROC curve. In other words, we don't need all the information if we're just making a binary answer off of that. Likewise, work by Boris at Siemens, whom we have collaborated with, showed that we can degrade the signal-to-noise ratio of our data by pretty dramatic amounts and still get that binary answer quite accurately. So what I'm going to kind of close up with then is a slightly broader vision. If you can incorporate context in this way, maybe you can start thinking about a different way of doing imaging. So let's say people come in and they get their index scan in a nice high field 3 Tesla scanner in a nice high resource outpatient or inpatient setting. Well, you use some sort of encoder to encode that information into a current representation of health. Next time, maybe you don't need a 3T scanner. Maybe you can use a 0.1 Tesla scanner. Maybe you can use a scanner built into a chair, which I guarantee all of you will have crappy image quality. We've tried it. But as I said, you don't necessarily need perfect image quality in order to at least update your sense of that person's representation of health. Maybe you can use wearables, right? Everyone's trying to use wearables to predict health, but they're doing it without any context at all. They're just trying to get the full answer with their Apple Watch. Why not use this context? So the idea is you go on and you accumulate a set of representations of health, and then when you see a change in the trajectory, that's when you say, ooh, you're not yourself today. Go and get a high-performance scan. We call this the Everywhere Scanner Project, and we're working piece by piece. And just in case any of you are curious, this sort of broader picture of a future of kind of proactive health with imaging is spelled out, at least in part, in this new book that I have coming out this fall. It's called The Future of Seeing. And I mention it to this audience in particular because I also try to lay out the long history, the sort of rich history of imaging from the development of eyes in the early oceans all the way up through our advanced MR and CT scans, and then try to predict how AI and abundant sensors are actually going to change the way we all see. Okay, well, with that, I think I'll close. I want to acknowledge my team at NYU on the left here, who continues to teach me so much, as well as my home team, Sarah, Hannah, and Noah there. And I want to thank all of you for your attention and invite any questions you might have.
Any questions for Dan from the audience?
Hi, Dan. Thanks for a super interesting talk. Could you comment a little bit about how the weight on the side information term and your objective function affects all of this? Because I didn't really see any discussion of how that weight was determined.
Forgive me for not including that. So we actually learn that end to end. At the moment, this is a fully supervised training. And so we actually are free to let the system sort of decide at these levels of undersampling. Presumably, that weight is going to be changed as you have different levels of undersampling and so on. We've also tried setting thresholds, making it 25% of the data consistency and so on, and we find we get close to the performance. But it's not massively dominating, and it's not tiny. It's sort of on the same order as our data consistency and our refinement block, if that helps.
Okay, great. And just another quick clarification question.
Yeah.
Was all of this testing data in distribution? It kind of seemed that it was. Or what happens when you go out of distribution and you try to use side information?
Yeah. So really good question. We have not tested that at all robustly yet. We are starting to test with cases where there's pathology on the side information that's not in the main information or vice versa. So we're deliberately trying to mismatch the two and see what happens. We haven't gone completely out of distribution and trained on knees and tried in brain, but that would be very interesting. Okay. Thanks.
So let me take an online question for you. This question is from Bernard Demon. Says, very nice talk, setting the bar high for the conference. In general, how can you guarantee or verify that critical anatomical features such as tiny tears are encoded in larger singular values and not hallucinated from the side information?
So that's a really good question, and we don't have a rigorous guarantee at this point. We're working on some harder theoretical guarantees involving mutual information between the main and the side information. But it is true that the low singular values are at risk of being overwritten because they are being affected by this ambiguous space consistency term. That said, they're at risk of being overwritten. They're not required to be overwritten at all. So that's a weak answer. All I can tell you is we're working on it more. The way we typically do this is we will follow up studies like this with clinical interchangeability studies, with reader studies. So it's fine to have all of the theory, but ultimately what you care is there something important missing that the radiologist can't see? And we have a whole team of radiologists, fortunately, at our disposal. And so we will essentially gather small pathologies and try to get at least some empirical guarantee that we don't lose them.
Thank you. Maybe another in person?
Before me. Okay. Well, very nice, Dan, as usual. So I just need to understand better. Are you trying to also generate new information from this site context? In the example that you showed there, it looks like there was a 24 undersample proton density, and then you were reconstructing a T2 weighted image. Is that being generated, or do you also need the the T2 weighted undersample acquisition?
Forgive me. No, we are actually acquiring the side information. Now, we have another approach we're working on, which is sort of a joint reconstruction where both the main and the side information are undersampled, and we sort of work back and forth between them to reconstruct. Some people have tried some things like that. What we found for this case, though, is it's best if our side information is only mildly undersampled, or at least less undersampled than the main. And that kind of serves as our anchor in this model. So we'll have a 2, 3, 5-fold undersampled side information, which is the range that we're capable of reconstructing with typical techniques. But then that serves as the measured side information for our main reconstruction.
And perhaps one more quick online question. This is from Matt's person. You touched on this, I think, a little bit. Do you need the raw data for the side information, or is the prior DICOM sufficient?
Really good question. We hope and believe. In this case, we had raw data. But our next case that we are going to study is using prior prostate images. And we don't have the old case-based data for all of that. So we are very much hoping that a prior DICOM will work. In fact, as I sort of alluded to, but I haven't shown you anything practical yet, we're hoping that we can even get some headway out of a text report from last time. If last time it said you have this lesion, unless the lesion's been removed, it's a nice prior for that image reconstruction. Again, remember, the idea here is we're not incorporating those features in a hard way. We're trying to disambiguate. We're trying to say which of the infinite set of possible reconstructions is more likely to be the truth. So DICOMs will work for that, text will work for that, other image modalities will in principle work for that. We'll just have to change that H block, that learned transform, that converts from the side information to something we can subtract from the main information. That'll be what's different in using DICOM, say, and RAW.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe one more quick question.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My question was a little bit related to previous, but it's a pretty quick one. So when you go back to the experimental details and you have that constraint, which is a projection has to be aligned with encoded, side information, and it's a soft constraint. And if you go back, the steers that you see, is it explainable from the measurements, or is it coming more from the side information, or have you, if you retrospectively look at the?
So we only have anecdotal evidence, particularly with that tear as of yet, but anecdotally, it is the main information because it is not particularly visible in the side information. It actually disappears in the PD, and it's really much more visible in the PDFS. There may be a vestige of it in the PD, but it's really hard to see. So our hypothesis is that really what's happening is the side information is giving you enough information about the boundaries of anatomy, about the main structures in the image, that the recon doesn't have to work very hard to get that stuff in place. It already tosses out everything else that isn't consistent with that. And then the main information, even though it's limited, only has to establish what's on top of that backdrop. And so therefore, even though it's lightly encoded in the main information, there's enough to put that tear where it should be. That's the hypothesis.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks so much.